Hey, Ziggy. Wanna come outside? Wanna come outside? You go, come outside. Ziggy. There you go. As you can see, he doesn't want, I was gonna say he still doesn't want to come outside, but he came outside yesterday when I wasn't making a video, and he came outside over the weekend, but now he doesn't want to come outside. I don't know. But he's a sentient being. And that brings me to the topic of today's video, which is, what do we mean by sentient being when we say that in Buddhism? People often ask this question because it seems like we are making a distinction between a sentient being and an insentient being. And for a lot of people, this distinction is really important because a sentient being is a being we ought to care about and, help and make efforts to save, saving all sentient beings and so forth. And an insentient being is one we don't have to care about. I remember when I was hanging out with the Hare Krishnas back in, 1,000 million years ago when I was a college student. And they made a big deal about sentient and insentient beings. I don't think they used those words, but they made a big distinction because one of their big things is vegetarianism, like strict vegetarianism. And that meant you could eat non-sentient beings and not eat sentient beings. But I remember some guy in the Hare Krishnas told me that fish are less intelligent than plants, or less sentient than plants. I don't remember the word he used. And then I asked him, well, why don't you eat fish then? But he didn't have an answer, or at least I don't remember his answer. I don't think it was a good answer, whatever it was. Then I saw that show Seaspiracy that was on, somebody was playing it on the cable, or whatever you call it these days. Streaming, that's what you kids are calling it these days. Anyway, and that one's all about fish and how sentient they are, and anyway. I don't want to get into that, but that's a big deal for some people. In Buddhism, though, there are two words that I have seen repeatedly translated as sentient being. And one of them is ujo. And ujo is used by Dogen and sometimes as a contrast to mujo. Here we go. And one of the most famous essays in which this occurs is Mujo Seppo. And my teacher translates that as the non-emotional preaches the Dharma. Most people translate that as the insentient preach the Dharma. And there, in case you want to know which book to look it up in, it's Shobogenzo Book 3. There are several other translations out there of this piece. And the reason he translates this as the non-emotional is because mujo literally means without emotion, without feeling. In contemporary Japanese, the word mujo means like heartless or, unfeeling, uncaring. But in classical Japanese and in Buddhist context, it means insentient, or that's how it's usually translated. Ujo is the contrast to that, which is often translated as sentient, but it means with feelings, literally with emotions, if you want to put it that way. Another word I've seen translated as sentient, I came across recently in this book, A Bird in Flight Leaves No Trace, which is a pretty good book, and I'll review it once I get done with it. Although, as usual, I'm reading 4 or 5 books at once, and so I'm only about 2/3 through this one. Pretty good, though. Anyway, a word that gets translated in there often as sentient beings is the word shusei. And shusei is represented by some kanji, which I'm going to try to reproduce on the screen, and we'll see if that works, in an old Chinese character that I had a hell of a time finding. In fact, I couldn't find it when I looked in the various sort of kanji looking up programs I use all the time. So I put it on Facebook, and some people who, I don't know how they found it, but they found it somehow. Anyhow, it is an older version of a contemporary Japanese character, which I'm going to try to show, Japanese-Chinese character, which I'm going to try to show on the screen, and I hope it works out, and it should be below if you're seeing it. And that compound would be translated by at least my feeble brain as various life. because the first character means a group or a crowd or an assembly, and then the second character means life, so various life. So it doesn't necessarily, at least in my understanding, refer strictly to sentience. So I'm not sure why this is a translation of Huang Po's writings, and I checked another translation of Huang Po's writings, and they also translate that character as sentient being. So maybe there's some precedent for translating it as sentient being, but it basically means various beings. Now, the question of sentience is one of these weird questions that would come up if you are looking at the Buddhist philosophy that everything is mind. And if everything is mind, then not only is every being sentient, all beings are sentients. So the mind, which is sometimes used as a synonym for sentience, is the basis for everything that you see. Fences, walls, tiles, and pebbles, as Dogen says, are mind. You and I are mind and manifestations of mind, and Ziggy is a manifestation of mind. Now, this thing about sentience and insentience, different cultures will give different gradations to what they consider sentient and insentient, and even our own culture has changed over time. There was a time when, in Western culture, at least in my understanding of reading old things in history classes and stuff like that, when the only things that were considered to be sentient were human beings. So animals, including Ziggy, including all the animals that human beings eat, and so forth, and cats are not considered sentient. And I remember seeing an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation where Data, the android character, recites a poem to his cat. And one of the lines, if I'm remembering correctly, was, "Although you are not sentient."
Oh, Spot. The complex levels of behavior you display connote a fairly well-developed cognitive array. And though you are not sentient, Spot, and do not comprehend, I nonetheless consider you a true and valued friend.
Which is kind of ironic because there's another episode of Star Trek The Next Generation in which they hotly debate the sentience of Commander Data, because Commander Data is a manufactured life form, an android, and whether he is sentient or not becomes a question, but that's all kind of fictional. My take on the Buddhist attitude towards sentient beings as opposed to insentient beings is that the distinction is kind of unimportant as far as most Buddhists are concerned. They're not saying sentient beings in order to set up a contrast. They don't say we take a vow to save all sentient beings in the Bodhisattva vows isn't to set up a contrast like we take a vow to save all sentient beings, but we don't want to save all those insentient beings. It's more of, at least this is my way of interpreting it after kind of seeing it over and over and over again for 30-some years, is that sentient beings is kind of a set phrase, sentient beings. You don't just say beings in a Buddhist context, you have to say sentient beings. And I'm not sure why. They just kind of mash those two words together, and it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference to them whether we're talking about plants or animals or people. They're all sentient beings, and probably in certain contexts you would include the entire material world as sentient beings. Now, I brought up Dogen's Mujo Seppo, and this is quite a fascinating little piece of work that I often reference, and I believe I wrote about it in It Came From Beyond Zen, although I'm not sure. Can't remember, but I know I've written about it here and there, and I know I've put something on my blog about it. So this essay, Mujo Seppo, the insentient preach the Dharma, or the non-emotional preach the Dharma, contains two bits that I really like, and the first one is a little story, and I'll read it to you. The National Master Daisho of Kotakuji Temple in the western capital in the great kingdom of Tang, the story goes, is asked by a monk, so this is in China. The monk says, "Can the insentient really preach the Dharma or not?" The National Master says, "They are always preaching ardently. They preach without interval." The monk says, "Why do I not hear it?" The National Master says, "Whether or not you hear it yourself, you should not disturb others who do hear it." The monk says, "I wonder what kind of person is able to hear it." The National Master says, "Saints are able to hear it." The monk says, does the master hear it or not? The national master says, I do not hear it. The monk says, if the master himself does not hear it, how does he know that the insentient preach the Dharma? The national master says, it is convenient that I do not hear it. If I heard it, I would be on the level of the saints, and then you would not be able to hear me preaching the Dharma. Ooh, burn. Then the monk says, so living beings are without the means to hear? The national master says, I preach for living beings. I do not preach for saints. The monk says, what are living beings like after they hear? The national master says, at that time, they are beyond living beings. Pretty weird, huh? So I like that little exchange. He basically says that some people can hear the insentient preach the Dharma and some people can't. The idea of the insentient preaching the Dharma, Dogen says, is, on the one hand, this is one of his sort of, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens moments. He's saying on one hand that it is hearing the sounds of wind through the trees and hearing water running through a brook and those kind of things, and understanding that that is preaching of the Dharma, but it isn't doing that stuff. It isn't hearing a brook and it isn't hearing the wind, because he wants to kind of get people off of those romantic notions like, I hear the wind, I'm hearing the Dharma. It's not like that, but it is that. So it's not aliens, but it's aliens. The other piece I like in this, I wrote an essay or a blog about it years ago called something like Dogen's Millions of Eyes or something, if you want to go look it up. It reminds me of the beast with 1,000 eyes. He says, we should study the words of the ancient that the whole universe in 10 directions is one eye. The whole of the 10 directions is just one eye. Furthermore, there are thousands of eyes on the tips of the fingers. There are thousands of eyes of right Dharma. There are thousands of eyes in the ears. There are thousands of eyes on the tip of the tongue. There are thousands of eyes on the tip of the mind. There are thousands of eyes of the thoroughly realized mind. There are thousands of eyes of the thoroughly realized body. There are thousands of eyes on top of a stick. There are thousands of eyes in the moment before the body. There are thousands of eyes in the moment before the mind. There are thousands of eyes of death in death. There are thousands of eyes of liveliness in liveliness. There are thousands of eyes of the self. There are thousands of eyes of the external world. There are thousands of eyes in the concrete place of eyes. There are thousands of eyes of learning and practice. There are thousands of eyes aligned vertically, and there are thousands of eyes aligned horizontally. Thus we study that the totality of eyes is the whole universe, but still this is not physical mastery of the eyes. And he goes on from there, but it's a pretty weird quote about these thousands of eyes. Now, an eye in Dogen speak is a locus of perception, so a kind of a sentience. So the eye in this case would be a stand-in for the concept of sentience. And he's saying this sentience exists basically everywhere. I don't think he means that list that he just gave to be exhaustive. Those aren't the only things in which sentience exists. But he's giving a bunch of examples of places where sentience exists, most of which we wouldn't think of as places where sentience exists, like on the tip of a stick. Well, that's a pen, but it's kind of a stick. Things like that. He's saying sentience is everywhere, but that even though we understand this is not physical mastery of the eyes. And so he kind of says this kind of stuff all over Shobo Genzo, and the way I understand it when he talks about physical mastery of something is he's meaning practice. So Dogen is all about Zazen practice and practice as a way to concretely realize something. So just to intellectually understand that there are eyes or sentience everywhere is not to physically master it, is not to fully master it. So we have to do a practice in order to come to a real sort of visceral bodily understanding of the whole thing. So there you go. That's my little talk about sentience and insentience. If you enjoyed that and you want to keep me being sentient by feeding me, please send me a donation on the URL that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen. That is my onlyest way to make money these days. So I really appreciate your contributions, but if you're having a financial hard time, don't send me any money, because I'm doing okay, but I'm doing okay because people are sending me money. So I thank you for those of you who are sending me money, and I hate saying this speech, but I have to say this speech because this is how it works. So I thank you very much. Have a good time all the time. See you later. Bye.